So, welcome back to Talk+Water, the podcast for Texas+Water, monthly publication of the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment, the Texas Water Resources Institute, and the Texas Water Journal. My name is Todd Votteler. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Texas+Water. And today I have a special guest, Lori Olson, who is the Executive Director of the Texas Land Trust Council. Welcome, Lori.
Hello, thank you very much. It's glad to be here.
So you really are our first person to interview who's not thinking about water 24 hours a day, which is good, I think, because that drives you mad slowly doing that. And so I was really happy that you were interested in coming on to talk to us, because you represent an organization which is working with landowners across the state of Texas to manage their land in a way that benefits not only wildlife but water. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the Texas Land Trust Council?
Okay. So, I've been working with the Texas Land Trust Council since 2011, I guess. I've worked in the field of land conservation for more than 20 years, working with land trusts largely across the country. And in Texas, we have over 30 land trusts that are all members of my council, and we work together to basically conserve land and water resources across the state of Texas.
So the 30 land trusts, are they each, say, working throughout the state, or some of them working in a more specific area? Are they pretty uniformly scattered around the state? What's the layout?
Yeah, so land trusts are basically nonprofit organizations whose mission is, in some part or in all, land and water conservation. And so that takes very many different forms. Some of them do operate statewide. Some of them operate, hyper locally in a small little, river basin, or even a creek basin of a stream or river. Or they might operate regionally, like for the hill country, or for the Houston Galveston Bay area, something like that. So there's all kinds of different levels in terms of how they are set up, and that's essentially dictated by how the organization evolves. It's a pretty organic process for, how a land trust forms, and, the people that come together to make it happen basically decide what they want to focus on for conservation purposes, and then they make that happen.
So I'd imagine that, I know the answer to this because I used to work with you, right? But the land trusts kind of vary in size and the number of staff, and some of them are
absolutely
more or less volunteers who don't get paid, and they're working on that. Tell us a little bit about kind of the range you see. And
absolutely. In Texas we have from the Nature Conservancy, which has, many, dozen staff and is very well equipped with resources and personnel, to an organization like the Wilburger Creek Conservation Alliance, which is, pretty small, has only a half-time staff person and a volunteer board of directors. But pretty much all land trusts are governed by a volunteer board of directors. So those are the people that have come together to guide the organization and help it, as it moves forward to make conservation projects a reality. But the staffing, it ranges. Most of the land trusts, I'd say, maybe have between 1 to 5 staff. But there's a few that are on the high end, and then a few that are literally all volunteers.
So you kind of mentioned, for example, the Nature Conservancy, which is that's an international organization. It's got operations in many countries in the world.
Yeah, worldwide. Yeah.
And then you mentioned another one that was essentially, a kind of a grassroots local effort to conserve it in the area.
Absolutely. So, I mean, they're very diverse. And, we have, I think, land trust movement as a whole, and there's, about 1,100 land trusts across the United States. I'd say the vast majority of them are very locally, grassroots based and focused, with, a handful to a dozen staff. And then there's a few big national organizations, like the Conservation Fund and the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy, who obviously operate at a different scale. But I would say the majority of the land trust sector is on that smaller, more grassroots level.
So how much, how many acres, I should say, within Texas do you think land trusts have conserved?
Yeah, so land trusts have had a hand in conserving over 1.65 million acres in Texas, which is a lot. It's more than the state parks system of Texas. So we have over 957,000 acres that are in conservation easements, which are a tool that land trusts use. Conservation easements are basically a voluntary legal agreement that restricts development rights on a piece of property to keep it open, natural, in an agricultural use and, recreation use, whatever, wildlife habitat, variety of different things can be done with an easement. But then also over 680,000 acres of fee simple properties that a lot of these, some of them are owned by the land trust themselves as private preserves, and others are projects that land trusts have had a role in helping to acquire that may have been then transferred to either a state or a local or federal park ownership.
And I imagine that the 1.65 million acres that you're talking about, they're probably in general not just your run-of-the-mill lands. That many of them are probably lands that have some ecological significance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, each land trust has its own criteria for what it wants to conserve. Some land trusts focus on specific ecosystems, like the Native Prairies Association of Texas, or certain types of lands, like the Texas Agricultural Land Trust focuses primarily on working landscapes. But then other groups have their own, like, for example, the Hill Country Conservancy. They're a regional land trust, but they have done some extensive research into GIS-based prioritization of lands for a variety of natural resource, considerations like water recharge and habitat for endangered species and all kinds of things. So there's different groups that are doing this level of sort of resource-based planning for where they want to prioritize their conservation lands. Others are looking to acquire lands, near other already protected areas to sort of enhance or expand those areas. So there's a variety of different strategies that are used.
So there used to be a lot of, misinformation about conservation easements going around. I can recall from the time I was really active. And just to kind of talk about some of those, I think, some people are under the impression that they have a conservation easement on their property that the public is now allowed to access their property.
Right. Yeah, no, that is definitely a misunderstanding. It's not a requirement at all that land under conservation easement be open to the public in any way. It does happen sometimes. Certainly sometimes people elect to do that, and they could open up a portion of their property maybe for a trail to go through it, or perhaps just on certain days under the guidance and with the oversight of land trust personnel to come and take people on guided hikes or something out on a property that might be encumbered by a conservation easement. But in general, by and large, especially in Texas, there is not a lot of public access. But that doesn't mean there's not public benefits. I mean, lands that are conserved are obviously providing, many, many economic and ecosystem, benefits for everybody, by being there for water resources to, flood mitigation, wildlife habitat, and all these great things. So even though there's no access, there's still a lot of great benefits being provided.
Now, there are really, I guess, two primary ways that people work with a land trust on an easement. I guess one is where the landowner donates the development rights to the land trust, and the other is where the land trust purchases those rights. Can you talk a little bit about those two types of easements?
Yeah, so I think the easements are basically, the same. Essentially, a conservation easement is a document that is, each one is unique, uniquely negotiated and uniquely drafted. So, but the easements they have a value. So if the landowner is putting a conservation easement on their property, they are essentially giving up development rights in some way, shape, or form, and they're doing that permanently. So they're basically reducing the development value, if you will, of their property. And so when you do a conservation easement, you get an appraisal done to sort of determine what that value is. You would say, okay, here's my value of my property at its highest and best use for what I could develop it as, and that's value A. And then if I place this conservation easement on it with these stated restrictions for development, it's worth value B. And so the difference between those two becomes what the easement is, quote unquote, worth. And then that amount is what you could, as a landowner, use to apply for a federal tax deduction. So we have a conservation easement-specific tax deduction at the federal level that allows landowners to deduct that value against their federal income taxes for up to 15 years. So they can have many, many years to sort of utilize the value of that deduction, because they typically tend to be very large amounts. And then the purchase of development rights is really more from programs that exist. Largely, they're agricultural use-related programs. So there's the Natural Resource Conservation Service at the federal level has an ag land conservation easement program that provides funds to purchase up to 50% of the value of a working lands easement. And typically they look for other natural resource values on those projects as well. And then in Texas, we have the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program, which also provides some state funding for the same purpose to essentially help acquire conservation easements on important working lands across the state. So there's also some other funding from like forests or working forests and things of that nature. So, but most of those programs to purchase are federal, and they're require, a land trust partner to apply for those funds, etc.
So, I often, heard, some comment that, hey, it really makes me nervous about, putting a restriction on my property permanently. And I've always thought, well, people, when they take land that's wildlife habitat or agricultural land,
yeah,
and they turn it into an apartment complex or parking lot,
that's permanent.
Right. It's just as permanent. I mean, yes. And so I've always kind of been, a little puzzled by the reaction that a permanent development of property of land is something that people have a lot more concern about than a permanent conservation of it.
Right.
And it seems like it's so hard to permanently conserve property through the instruments that are available as opposed to development.
Well, certainly, the instruments that we have, funding is always a limiting factor. But, I mean, the reality is that, if you want to, keep your land open and make that commitment permanently with a conservation easement, that's a landowner's, right to choose to do that, just like you said, just like it would be their right to elect to develop an apartment complex on top of the land. I mean, once, when you do that, the land is forever changed. We have, a saying that people say, asphalt is the last crop. Once you do that, it's a done deal. So I think, it's just about, to me, land conservation and conservation easements and what we do. They're not for everybody, but it's just one of those tools that's available. And, if you're the right person that wants to do that for your land and your family's, property, and you want to see that maintained throughout the generations, then, this might be the tool for you. So it's just one of those things. It's not for everybody, but it's a great option for those people who want to do it.
And they can still sell their property, just has the easement on it.
Absolutely. I mean, essentially the easement stays with the property, in perpetuity. It transfers from the current owner to future owners, and the property can be sold. It would just be sold with the easement on it. So the value of that property is encumbered by the restrictions on the easement. So the value of what you get for it is going to be affected by the easement.
And I've kind of noticed that some of the properties in the hill country, not too far from Austin or San Antonio, that have easements on them, it doesn't end up actually even reducing the value of the property that much.
That's true. I mean, in one sense, if you have a property that you could have built condominiums on it and you put an easement on it, significantly would reduce the value, and then potentially, obviously you're never going to get that level of value back. But the benefits of putting an easement on your property can be very significant financially as well. And we've actually seen in places where there are areas where there are several easements around. So a lot of times this will happen, like one landowner will do one and they'll talk to their neighbors and they're like, oh, that's great. That's a great thing. I want to do that too. And you'll get sort of this critical mass of easements. And that's happened in some places in the hill country, but also out in West Texas, around Fort Davis and Davis Mountains. And we have seen the property values of those residential areas actually increase because the easements are there and they're permanent. And so those people that go to buy those houses and those properties know that the landscape around them and their view shed is going to be forever protected. So it actually ends up giving a net benefit down the line.
It also seems like there are some people who really are looking for a small ranch in the hill country that they don't want to develop. They want to, hunt out there and they want to spend time with their family out there or retire out there or something. And the easement, it doesn't actually represent a real burden to them. It's something that they're actually kind of looking to do.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's true. The key in terms of doing it and, finding a land trust partner to work with too is making sure, land trusts are very cognizant of, making sure that they're doing projects that are going to be valuable from a conservation standpoint, long term. And so, there might be, size restrictions in terms of like you would need to have a size of X 100 acres or greater in order to make that work or make it feasible, because you wouldn't want to come with a 50-acre ranchette, for example. That would probably not be the best candidate for a conservation easement just because it would be a little bit too small. But I think in general, people that are looking to find ranch properties, wildlife, a lot of people are converting from ag use, like, they were ranching cattle and they're converting to wildlife management. And so all those are essentially still agricultural uses. And so all of these properties that are, doing whatever they're doing, if the landowner wants to continue maintaining those activities, they could place an easement on their property and essentially keep all of their activities that they're doing exactly the same. And the only thing that's going to happen is they're going to get a financial benefit from placing that easement on the land and restricting the development potential in perpetuity. So it can be a real attractive option for people that, like you said, whose interests already lie in that direction.
So it seems to me that land trusts have kind of benefited from, I guess, a period in which it almost seems like there's less litigation over environmental issues in some respects because maybe it's harder to prevail now, and that maybe there's, and this is just me thinking out loud, and I could be totally wrong, but it seems to me that there maybe is now somewhat of a focus, more of a focus, try to find ways for people to work together cooperatively, and that land trust may be a big beneficiary of that.
Yeah, I think, private land conservation has definitely expanded, in the recent years. We have been able to utilize farm bill programs and other funds to do a lot more easements on working lands across the country. And I think that because of the nature of them, because they are voluntary, because they are on private lands and the lands remain in private ownership, so the government is not taking on the full burden of property ownership and management, like they would if they acquired parks, or other conservation lands. The land trust, or in some cases government entities, hold the conservation easements, and they're limiting their financial, outlay to acquire that, but also the management costs. And then it's just a much more cost-effective method for doing conservation long-term and on a larger scale. You can make your resources and your available funding go much further with conservation easements, and the burden on a long-term management for the public entities is much less. So I think from that perspective, it's attractive. And, it's really been, land trust community has really enjoyed a lot of bipartisan support over the years for all of our initiatives and for getting our federal tax incentive passed, for doing, funding conservation programs like the Farm Bill. And we've enjoyed a lot of success from on both sides of the aisle, just because these issues they resonate with everybody. And I think conservation is one of those issues that has always been and hopefully will always be a bipartisan issue that everyone can support. Our economies, our water resources, our wildlife, all these things are dependent on conservation efforts long term. So I think that's why it's enjoyed such success.
Well, and that's a good segue into my next question, which is the Land Trust Council is now Texas. I should say the formal name, I guess. Texas Land Trust Council is now active during the Texas legislative sessions, and I think you make at least one trip up to D.C. every year to interact with our members of Congress. And so I'm just curious, how is that going?
Well, it's been going well. We started more of an advocacy role back in 2011, 2012. The land trust community in Texas started to get a little bit more active in terms of just, reaching out to our elected officials to let them know all of the great things that we're doing in their communities. And one of the programs that we had started working on and trying to get funded was the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program, and that was actually funded by the legislature with an appropriation for the first time in 2015, and then it was funded again in 2017. So, and we're hopeful we'll be approaching them again this coming session in January, and hoping to get money in that program again. That's been the first real sort of dedicated money for conservation in the state of Texas, and so we have been very excited about that. We've been working to also just to make sure that land conservation is a tool that's being utilized and that's able to be funded through other programs like the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, drinking water, obviously, land conservation in the watershed of a drinking water supply is essential to keeping that water quality good. And so land trusts have been working on projects in that area. And, with all of the recent flooding events that we've experienced, unfortunately, in Texas, land trusts have also been kind of getting engaged in, talking about how land conservation can help to mitigate some of the most damaging, effects of flooding, and by conserving lands that are, essentially most vulnerable to flooding events and repeat flooding events. So those are a lot of the ways that we're starting to engage. At the federal level, we do engage with all of our land trust colleagues around the country on advocacy issues, and so it's been fun to be part of that as well, and to just advance, all kinds of funding and programmatic issues around land and water conservation.
So you mentioned how, from, I guess, the point of view of recovering from Hurricane Harvey, that land trusts have been active in this debate about, resiliency and,
yes.
Climate change and how we prepare for natural disasters. And so, in addition to, I guess, floodplain preservation, what do you think are some of the other water-related benefits that land trusts have provided to the state?
Well, I mean, yeah, conservation lands definitely have a role in protecting water resources. I mean, as rain falls everywhere, it's falling for the most part on some, natural landscape. We do have still, 85 or so % of our lands in Texas are open, agricultural or other open 1D1 lands. So the water's falling on the land, and then it flows to our sources of drinking water. So the more that we can, capture that water and let it percolate slowly through the ground to our aquifers and into our streams and lakes and rivers, the higher our water quality is, and the better our ability to capture and hold that rainfall. And that has been shown, scientifically, like prairies are just excellent at capturing water and putting it into the ground. That those types of things really do help with the quantity of the water that we're able to capture. In fact, we've been working on some research over the last couple of months that we're hoping to bring to the legislature this year to show just exactly how much those economic, benefits that are provided by these natural ecosystems that exist in conservation lands and what those economic benefits are for Texas. So some of our preliminary numbers, show that we have about over 60 million, per year in terms of water quality and quantity benefits. And, hundreds of millions in terms of potential flooding mitigation benefits. So that's exciting. We're hoping to demonstrate that a little bit better, which we hope will lead to even more funding for the good work that we all do.
Good. So do you have an agenda for this upcoming session of the Texas legislature?
Well, our agenda is basically going to be to stay involved with the discussions that we anticipate will happen around flooding and flooding mitigation, and also to obviously get more funding for our support for the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands conservation programs and other conservation opportunities that might also emerge around the state. So we the session has not even begun yet. So our eyes are open, and we're working with all of our partners to identify all of the opportunities that might exist for us to get involved. But one of our main goals this session is going to be to really just try to educate and communicate these economic benefits that we've been developing to the legislature and members of the legislature in order to work on building that financial support in the future.
Okay, that sounds good. And you've got a conference that you do annually. Why don't you tell us about that, when it's going to be held, and maybe some more of the specifics about it?
Sure. So, we do a conference every year. It's called the Texas Land Conservation Conference, and it's going to be in its 22nd year, I believe. So, it's a great event. It's a 3-day event. This year, in 2019, it'll be happening on Wednesday, February 22nd, Thursday, February 28th, and Friday, March 1st. And it'll be in Austin. It's actually being held at the Hilton at the Austin airport. So we're going to have lots of different topics all around land and water conservation issues, looking at conservation easements, looking at farm bill programs, looking at how land conservation is involved in carbon markets, looking at using the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, looking at funding for conservation, looking at issues in advocacy for conservation, doing, let's see, what else we have? We're going to be talking about the border wall and how that impacts, or would impact, and frankly already does impact, conservation of natural resources along our border with Mexico. So, and also talking about the nexus of conservation with groundwater. So we have a lot of great issues coming up for this year and every year, frankly. So, hope some of your listeners can come and join us.
Well, good. So if they want to register, where should they go? Why don't you tell them that?
They should go to TexasLandConservationConference.org, and you can find out all the information there, get lots of information on our detailed agenda and sessions, and get registered and all kinds of good stuff. So, that's where you go.
That's long. That's a long one. TexasLandConservationConference.org.
Yep.
Okay.
It is. It's long, but it's the name of the thing, so it is what it is.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Well, it's really been good to have you on the podcast with me today.
My pleasure.
I've really enjoyed, the time that I had to work with you on the Land Trust Council, and I always just felt like, land trusts are, and the conservation easement movement are maybe one of the most important developments in the conservation movement in the last 20 years, and I really just don't get the kind of what is the term I'm looking for? The coverage that they deserve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think more and more, land trusts are trying to get more savvy about getting, media attention and things like that. But it's hard. There's a lot of things going on in the world, and so it is hard always to grab that bandwidth in the media. But, what we do is so good and so exciting and has so many great, wonderful benefits. I think when people do learn about land trust, land conservation, they get excited about it and get involved because it's just a really awesome thing. Like you said, it's a key part of the land and water conservation movement in Texas and in the country. And so, yeah, it's fun. It's fun to do, and it's fun to be a part of it.
Good. Well, Lori Olson, thank you so much for being with me today on the podcast, and we look for even more great things from you and from land trusts in the state of Texas.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be on, and I'll look forward to maybe some future engagement down the road.
Sounds good.